black is that. You see what I'm saying? Black is not perfect. You see, black is not superior. I want to make that very clear. That it's very important that we understand that we have got to take a reasoned point of view. You see, we cannot say repel from white supremacy and then go to black supremacy. Change, here you coming, but your steps are too loud. Change, even lamppost changes, Negro. Change, stop being an instant yes machine. Change, Negroes don't change, they just grow. That's a change, bid and begging Negro.
Good evening and welcome to For the People. First, a personal note. I want to thank all of you for your expressions of love and concern demonstrated during the early period of my illness and subsequent hospitalization. And during this period of recovery, it helps to know that so many of you care. Thank you. So many of the writers of the much talked about 60s were like shooting stars. They burst on the scene with a flash, but were never heard from again. Not so with Haki Mahabuti, formerly Don L. Lee, poet, publisher, and educator. A highly respected poet and writer, Mr. Mahabuti's books include Think Black, Black Pride, Don't Cry, Scream, Enemies, The Clash of Races, and Black Men, Obsolete, Single, Dangerous, The African-American Family in Transition. Mr. Mahabuti is the publisher of Third World Press, director of the Institute for Positive Education in Chicago, and professor of English at Chicago State University. He received the American Book Award in 1991 and was named Author of the Year for the state of Illinois by the Illinois Association of Teachers of English. We begin by asking Mr. Mahabuti to tell us about the road that led him to poetry and publishing.
Well, my background was not so much unlike the average black person in America. Born in Little Rock, Arkansas. You know, like John Killens, we came up south to Detroit, Michigan. A single parent home. My mother, I have a sister also, she was an uneducated woman. She was not schooled. And she did odd jobs to keep us alive, you know, day work, things like that. Ended up having to take jobs in bars and taverns, and eventually got hooked on alcohol and drugs, and ended up essentially not being able to function at the age of 34, and by 35 she was dead. And so I was on my own at 16 years old. But prior to her death, she had introduced me to Richard Wright, Black Boy. And the interesting thing about that, this was back in the 50s, she asked me to go to the Detroit Public Library to check Black Boy out, and I refused to go, primarily because I didn't want to go any place and ask for anything black. I mean, that's how the self-hatred was a part of my life, part of our community, in fact. But anyway, I did check the book out, found it on the shelf myself, went to the library, sit down and started reading Richard Wright's Black Boy. And for the first time in my life, at the age of 13, I had been introduced to ideas about us that were not embarrassing. And so Richard Wright kind of put me on the path, teaching me very early the importance of literature. And so after my mother passed, I came to Chicago, stayed in the Y and finished high school. Ended up in the Army at 17, 18 years old. By that time, I had put myself on a self-re-education program because I was raised in white studies. You see what I'm saying? That in white studies, we really did not receive anything formally in school about ourselves that was inspirational, you see, or developmental. Our formal study was basically slave history, okay? And so I was on a re-education program and ended up in the Army, and on the way to basic training, Fort Leonard, Missouri, I was reading a book by Paul Robeson titled Here I Stand. And you know, Paul Robeson was a big, magnificent black man, and his picture was on the cover of the book. And going into Fort Leonard, Missouri on this bus with all these other white recruits, there were just 3 blacks, and the rest were white draftees. And as I got off the bus, the drill sergeant noticed the book, snatched it from my hands, and said, what's your Negro mind doing reading this black communist? Okay, that's the first time I've heard a double negative like that, okay? So he said, okay, all you women up against the bus. That's how you put men down at that time. You call them women, right? That's how the sexist was just so pervasive. And he took the book and held it over his head and commenced to tear the pages out and gave a page to each of the recruits and told them to use it for toilet paper. And of course, I said to myself, what am I doing here? I mean, how did I put myself in a position where men, most certainly less intelligent than I am, would be giving me orders for the next 3 years? Well, the Army for us was a boy job. I mean, there was no employment, and this is all that I could do, so I ended up in the Army. And I decided right then and there that I discovered something that was so important and so crucial to the development of all people that we had never been really pushed in our community, and that something was the importance of ideas. Mm-hmm. Ideas and the creators of ideas, and those who take the ideas and make them actual, run the world. You see, everybody else run after them. Mm-hmm. All right? And I knew that ideas, at least the ideas in Paul Robeson's book, Here I Stand, and other books I was reading at the time, were not the ideas that we talked about very much in our communities, you see. And so I said, well, okay, I got 3 years, what am I going to do with myself? And what I decided to do was to study everything that I could find on our people, you see, fiction, nonfiction, history, political work. And I decided also at the age of 18 that I was never going to put myself in a position where people outside of my race would know more about me than I knew about myself. Mm. And I also decided that I would...
Say that again?
That people outside of my race would know more about me or our people than I did, you see. And I also made a decision that I would never, ever again apologize for being black, you see. That would not become part of my lexicon at all.
How did you feel back then? How did you feel about being black?
Well, obviously, growing up in America, we grew up with a great deal of self-hatred. That's why I didn't want to go to the library to ask for Black Boy, to check Black Boy out, because I was ashamed of being black. And this was not something that our families necessarily consciously taught us. It was self-conscious, a part of growing up in a white society that valued everything white, and that the opposite of white, which was, of course, black, was devalued, you see. And so when I discovered that black people had, in fact, not only were the bringers of civilization, but also has participated in the development of civilization throughout our history, then, of course, it became a different story. But I had to search for that, and I had to look for it for myself. And of course, being in the vanguard in the 60s of the whole Black Studies movement, that's when we began to push it and make it a part of the curriculum in high schools and colleges and so forth.
So how do you feel about the opponents of African-centric education who say that, well, African history, as presented by the so-called African-centrist historians, is just a feel-good type thing?
Well, I think that when people...
Because you said earlier about how you felt about yourself.
Sure.
Because of the absence of African history and just learning European history.
Well, what I found in my short tenure on this earth, that when people are afraid of something, or when they do not understand something, the best way to dismiss it is to belittle it, you see, is to make fun of it. Obviously, when we look at any people's history, we're going to find those things that are positive and negative. And what has happened, most certainly in terms of our own field of studies, well, we call it African-centered studies. That we've used it for over 20-some-odd years now in our school in Chicago. And obviously, if your history is giving you an accurate portrayal of oneself, it's going to make you feel good, you see. But at the same time, we know that errors have been made, mistakes have been made, and all history is not, quote-unquote, positive, all right? And I think that what has happened, and this has come out of New York primarily, behind the whole fight against Leonard Jeffries, that you have a group of white historians that have not really studied African history or any other history other than that which is European-based, and therefore they're in a protective mode, in a defensive mode, you see. What we're trying to do is to search for truth, and that the truth in all of its complexity will be both positive and negative.
Okay, let's get back to the road that led you to become a poet. When did you start writing? And
well, I had discovered the great black poets in the late 50s, early 60s. Langston Hughes, Gwendolyn Brooks, Margaret Walker, Alexander, Claude McKay, Conte Cullen, Gwendolyn Bennett, Jean Toomer. So I'm saying that I had, in my re-education process on my own, I had discovered these poets. And what was very beautiful about what they were writing was that I could see myself. But also I discovered that I did not see all of me. You see, I'm saying, yes, they are indeed telling our story, but I think I got a story to tell also. And as a result of that, I began to write poetry on my own, by studying black poetry primarily. And what happened, once I got out of the service, this was 1963, I got an early out because of some difficulty I had in the service, trying to organize and trying to be black primarily. And when I got out in August of 1963, and of course in September of 1963, that's when the 4 girls were bombed in the church in Birmingham. And that act essentially just changed my life forever. Because I realized that in a country that would kill its own children in the house of the Lord, then there was something seriously wrong with the country and with the people in the country. And so I decided that I had been trained as a warrior. Then what I'm going to do is basically use my skills and my talents for the development of myself, my family, and my people. And since I was now working with the written words, I decided I was going to become a writer, and began to just single-mindedly focus on writing.
Now you were reading the, back to the military period, reading a book by Paul Robeson, and one of your, I guess, higher-ups, a sergeant or whatever, tore the book to pieces.
Right.
And you were there to defend the country.
Right.
What was the lesson there, and what was the lesson there for you?
Well, I guess the major lesson was that here, that if you did not participate in the 100% patriotism, all-out defense of the ideas that, for the most part, they were working against our development, then there was something inherently wrong with you. And of course, I would not buy into that.
Has that changed any?
Not too much. Not too much. What has happened, well, certainly, is that the military has become a lot more quote-unquote integrated, in the sense that you have now black men and women much more in the officers' corps. Okay, as you know, most certainly in the armed service, 30% of the non-commissioned men and women are black and Hispanic and Latino. So what has happened, and I think that you see the development of, say, Colin Powell, now the Joint Chief of Staff. Well, politically, it's like a politically correct move for George Bush to make him Chief of Staff, primarily because now most of the wars, the surrogate wars, will be fought in the Third World, are fought among people of color. And what would be best to justify that than a person of color to justify these wars? So I'm saying that black men and women have been able to rise in rank, you see. But in terms of real decision-making, you see, by the armed forces, most certainly, they only take orders. Okay. So I think a lot of our people say, well, we use the service as a stepping stone. And I must be very honest that for me, when I went into the service in 1960, there was nothing else that I could do. That you didn't have McDonald's, you didn't have, the Burger Kings, you didn't have the fast food joints. You couldn't get a job any place. And so that was the first time in my life that I was able to receive 3 meals a day and clothes and even receive a salary. But I would not send my children to the armed forces at all, no.
Okay. In your book, From Plan to Planet, you say, quote, "We have internalized the oppressor's values to the point where we're him. We have moved so far from our actual and natural African selves that we must deal with the oppressor within before we can effectively take on the one outside."
That's very important. That was written in the 1960s, was published in 1973. What was very clear to me, especially being the color I am, and as you know, there's a great problem still among our people, the color problem among black people in terms of dark-skinned, light-skinned black people. What I realized very early was that I was given very small privileges, you see, in school, just because of my colors, not because of my intellect or anything else, because I could begin to see that the teachers who are all white would favor those students in the classroom that were light-skinned, okay? Obviously, at that age, I couldn't make too much out of it, but I could see the difference there. And so what was happening, that those black persons that were light-skinned and closer in proximity to white folks, that they were given small privileges. Now, when I began to study, and most certainly say, you know, get to a historian like Chancellor Williams, when he talked about how white men traveled around the world and generally left their women at home. And wherever they traveled in the world, they dropped their seeds wherever they, you know, whatever country they began to try to take. In fact, there's a saying in South Africa that the colored race did not exist till 9 months after the white man got there, you see. So what was happening to me was that was kind of a double bind. That here I'm trying to, as best as I could, identify with black people, our people. On the other hand, you find a great many light-skinned black people trying to identify with white people. Okay, so you kind of caught in between. And even though I did not know this was the African principle, but the African principle says the greatest good for the greatest number of African people, that what I was trying to do in a very early age is say, I'm going to identify with those persons that I grew up with and who I feel are, you know, like me. Well, most certainly, in formal education, we are not taught to love ourselves. Okay, so we grow into adulthood with a lot of doubts, a lot of ambiguity in terms of who we are, where we belong, et cetera, et cetera. And as I read and studied, what it became very clear to me that in order for us to be comfortable with ourselves, that we have got to get rid of the horror stories inside of us. And these horror stories are everything from, you know, dealing with the whole skin color, dealing with how white folks treat us, dealing with how black folks who think they're white folks treat us, and so forth. And once I was able to exercise these horror stories out of me, it became very clear to me that I have a choice. And the choice is very clear to me that I have got to identify with the people who I'm truly a part of, and that will be African people worldwide. Now, for me to get to the point where I was very comfortable with that, I did several things. One, I continued to study. Two, I traveled. You see, I used to just take Greyhound buses and go to black communities all around the country. You see, I was based in Detroit. I would go up to Cleveland. I'd go to Toledo. I would go south to Atlanta, and I would just go for weekends. You see, because as a writer, I was trying to essentially get the mood of the country, the mood of our people. And every place I went, I was accepted, you see, without too much discussion. And so it became very clear to me that we do have choices that we make, you see. And what was very clear also, once I got out the country, okay, I first went to Africa in 1969 and have been back many times since then. But I began to see that black people are not only African-based, we essentially are world people. You see, black people are all over the world. And as I traveled, especially throughout the Western Hemisphere, say down to Central America, down in Brazil, places like that. In fact, in Brazil, there are approximately 70 million people of African descent speaking Portuguese. Okay, now in the United States, you have approximately 35 million people of African descent speaking English. You see, I mean, attempting to speak English anyway. And so, and we don't communicate with each other. You have over 150 million people of African descent in the Western Hemisphere, if not more. All right. So it was very clear to me that we are indeed a world people. Two, that where we are, there are people searching for their identity, trying to find themselves and make a connection. And number three, white world supremacy is fighting day and night to stop us from making these connections, you see. And so I found, you know, my charge in life when I began to see that as we work very hard to find ourselves and connect with other people of African descent, on the other side of the road, I saw people working overtime trying to stop the connection, you see.
How did they go about the white supremacy force? How did they go about trying to keep African people from making that connection?
Oh, there are many ways of neutralization. And I talk about that a great deal in Black Men. But neutralization starts with, one, miseducation, okay, which they define as education. But it's just like saying the third world is underdeveloped when it's really misdeveloped, you see. It's the use of terms in terms of how people communicate. And our miseducation started basically with our being indoctrinated in white studies, that we grew up reading the Eurocentric are European masters, and as they are defined, and therefore they become our masters, even though, because we have not developed critical thinking. You see, most certainly we have not developed critical thinking in terms of ourselves. So education, miseducation is one of the major ways. Number two is that mass media, okay? That up until we fought very hard in the 60s and 70s to get programs like this on television, that for the most part, we grew up looking at, Amos and Andy, looking at imitation white folks, you see, from Julia to any other number of other shows that came on in the 60s and 70s, that the mirror image, for the most part, was saying that it's okay to try and be white when actually we were killing ourselves, all right? Now, it's important to understand that if a person is not properly anchored in himself or herself, then there will always be doubt. There will always be insecurities. There will always be challenges which will not be met, you see, because he or she is not properly anchored. When a person is properly anchored in him or herself, that means that he or she can travel throughout the world and deal with any people as equal. You see, so when I come to a table now in Chicago dealing with other artists, or dealing with printers, or dealing with, I teach at Chicago State University in Chicago, dealing with other professors, then you come to the table as an equal. And therefore, they recognize that what you're bringing to the table is at the same level in which they're bringing their material to the table. And so, in all facets of life, education, sports, take sports. You look at the basketball. I mean, the Bulls just took a double championship, all right? 90% of the team is black, okay? But the ownership's white, okay? You look at major athletes in this country, are mainly black. Now, my son was 14 years old, and they had, on television, they had one of the players receiving an astronomical amount of money, say $25 million for maybe about 4 or 5 years. And one of the commentators he was saying that, well, this was going to destroy the game, paying all these athletes, some of these black athletes all this money. And my son asked me about that. He said, what about that, Dad? I said, well, look, son, always think about this. Whatever this athlete is making, this black athlete is making, look who signed the check, you see. And the person that signed the check is making 4 or 5 times that, maybe at a daily rate. You see, so don't worry about that. The point I'm trying to make is that anytime we are able to get our foot in the door, we can succeed. But the problem is we are born into a country where close to 75% of the country are working against us succeeding, you see, in any number of ways, all right? Institutional racism has been documented as being very effective, you see, at most of the colleges and universities, high schools and so forth. And so it's a long road for an individual to try to find him or herself. This is why we push the importance of developing cultural families or social families, developing institutions, independent black institutions, developing networks, brotherhoods and sisterhoods, where brothers and sisters can begin to talk together and begin to go deeply into to themselves and begin to get some of these horror stories out of them.
Speaking of the horror stories, let's get back to the intra-racial problems, color problems that you talked about earlier. What would you say to the parents of today? I know Francis Welsing some time ago, Dr. Welsing, the psychiatrist, had mentioned that many parents, when a child is born, still will look at that air and say, it's got dark ears, then it's going to be a dark baby. Or like, what would you say to parents to help them better understand how they should handle the different shades of black within the family?
Within the family? I would like to say that color is irrelevant, okay, most certainly among ourselves. And I would hope that at some point we can begin to cleanse ourselves to really realize that and recognize that. Most certainly, I think that what has to happen is that people have to be comfortable with who they are, you see, whatever color it may be, whatever texture of the hair, you see. And I think that we have to teach children that. As you know, we have a school in Chicago, New Concept Development Center. And when you walk into our school, you see us. You see all the different shades of us, not only in terms of the students that attend the school, but also in terms of what's on the walls, the teachers that teach there, and so forth. And what's very clear to us is that we don't make any big issue out of color at all. And when we hear the children doing it, then we sit down and talk to them very carefully about it. Because this color thing has just about, can destroy us if we allow it to get out of hand. I think that the 60s was a very good period for us, because what the 60s did was begin to bring it into the forefront where black began to be beautiful, which it is. But at the same time, in the 60s, we recognized that nobody's going to tell us that we're beautiful except us, that we have to be the proponents of that beauty. We have to be the people who perpetuate the beauty within ourselves. And so, in fact, in the book, I argue, what should we call ourselves, African Americans or black? Well, my argument is that we use both terms, and primarily because as long as black is negative, or long as black is not redemptive, as long as young children or grown-ups prefix their invectives against each other with you black so-and-so, you black this and that, then we cannot give up black. You know what I'm saying? That we have got to make black a color that we appreciate. I don't hear white people saying you white so-and-so, you white this and that. In fact, the only negative thing I ever heard white people call each other is white trash. You see, beyond that, generally white is very positive to white people.
Action.